into all of that with you. But before that, I'd just like to know how you're doing, because this is such a weird time between the racial violence in the country and coronavirus. And you're a stay-at-home dad, kind of, but you've also
Uh-huh.
launched this new record
Uh-huh.
on Juneteenth. How are you holding up?
Well, I'm doing well. My family's doing well, and my family brings me a lot of joy. And so it's interesting the juxtaposition of the joy, love I feel within my family, and then, of course, seeing so much pain in the streets. And so we live with both. We live with the broader grief and the broader outrage and the broader resolution that we need to do better, but also. We can still feel that joy and that love and the connection on a human to human level that we get from our friends and our family and our loved ones. And I feel both of those things.
I feel them both too, but I guess, this weekend I've been listening to your song, your whole record, which is amazing, but
Thank
Favorite
you.
Place for some reason has been sticking in
Uh-huh.
my head. And
Uh,
I'm thinking about that and the joy listening to it. And then I think about what's going on in the world and what's in the streets and people dying and this horrible racial justice. And I actually find it hard to express my joy publicly
uh-huh.
when I see all that. And you've done the reverse. You've kind of leaned into it and you're
Yeah.
showing the world moments of joy. There are obviously people who feel like this isn't the time for that.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, of course, I can't take credit for kind of zigging when everyone else is zagging because I was writing these songs before the pandemic, wrote them before I saw everyone in the streets marching for George Floyd's life. And so these songs, they take a bit longer to develop. I wrote them over 2019 and early 2020. There's a lot of arranging work and mixing and all these other things that go into making an album. So there's a lot of lead time that goes into that process. So the question was, having felt really confident about the album as a body of work, having felt really confident about the group of songs we had put together, do we change our plan now that the world changed quite a bit? And I don't count George Floyd's killing as a dramatic change because, of course, we've seen instances like that before. We saw it with Eric Garner. We saw it with Michael Brown. Different individual circumstances, but symptoms of the same issue within our criminal punishment system and our policing system in the country. And it's something we've been thinking about and talking about for a long time. But of course, the pandemic added a whole different layer to our thoughts about everything, thinking about the way government works, the way healthcare works, the way environmental injustice works, the way we think about our jails and prisons as a vector for disease transmission. A lot of things changed because of the pandemic. And so then the question was, do you release an album during the pandemic? And part of me thought one reason why I should release it is one, people need a lift, they need a hug, they need some love, they need some connection in their lives. Two, this pandemic is not going to be over soon. It's going to be part of our lives probably for at least another year until there's a vaccine that's readily available or a cure that at least mitigates the worst harms of the disease to the point where no one's really that afraid of getting the disease. So that could be a year or so or more before that happens. And if I were to sit on the album waiting for the pandemic to finish, it felt like it would just be too long and I would write more music and maybe release another album, within a year or two in that time period. And I might as well put out what I have now. And what I have now is something I'm so proud of, put so much heart and soul into it. And it has an added benefit of being a moment of joy and love and connection in a moment when people could use it.
Yeah, I mean, and you should be damn proud. It's incredible.
Thank you.
But do you think about imagery? Like right now, we see so many images of African Americans in pain. There's a way in which the record, it doesn't discount any of that, of course, in your life's work and meaning, but you're also showing joy at the same time. It strikes me as that's an important thing for society to move on. I think we've lost John. He's rendering or something. So,
Okay, I lost you for a second. Okay,
not,
I moved. Maybe I have better reception here.
cool, yeah. So I'm not sure if you heard me, but I was just saying, like, do you think about imagery and the fact that we're seeing these, horrible images of African Americans suffering, and the record and your whole existence? Yes, you talk about all that stuff. It's deep in your soul and you public voice, but also you can express joy. And it strikes me as that kind of juxtaposition of images is actually really important for the world to see. I think we've lost him again. Let's give him a second. While we're waiting, Bigger Love came out on Juneteenth, and it's on Spotify and anywhere else that you can get.
Oh, you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, so sorry about that. But yeah, I wrote about it when I introduced the album to the world. I said, so many of the images you've seen of us has been us grieving, us in outrage, us with literal knees on our necks. And, part of what artists can do is express all the things that are components of our humanity, the joy, the connection, all of that. And that's part of what Black art has been doing for so long. We've been insisting on being joyful, insisting on being resilient, despite all the challenges that this world has thrown our way.
So when you say that, John, I'm thinking of a song like the last song on the record, Never Break, which is an ode to resilience, right? It is exactly what you're talking about there. How do you write something like that? Obviously, you wrote it before all this stuff, as you were saying, but what's your process? Like, I mean,
Well, all the songs are written in a similar process. I've been writing for such a long time that I've learned what's the best way for me to conjure up a song. But it usually starts with a core of an idea. So this one was We Will Never Break. And then we played around with different melodies and music around that. And then once we figured out what the rest of the music was, then we built the lyric from that. So usually we'll play around until we're like, oh, this is what the chorus should sound like. This is the central idea of the song. And then I'll scat other ideas for the verse without a lyric, but with a melody and a rhythm. And then eventually come up with the full lyric for the song that tells the story that I want to tell, that tells it from my perspective, and also sings really well. So that's usually the idea. It usually takes around 3 or 4 hours. A lot of times there's another collaborator or two in the room with me doing it. So on this particular song, it was me, Mr. Hudson, Greg Wells, and Nasri. So 4 of us sitting in a room just jamming on the piano, singing different ideas to each other until we got excited about something. And, for my personal inspiration, I was thinking about my own family. And Chris and I, we always talk about how we're not going to get divorced. And you never know what life's going to bring your way, but you try to resolve in your own marriage and in your own relationship that no matter what, we're going to figure it out. We're going to work through it, and we're going to be resilient. And then also the lyric talks about it being bigger than just you and me. And it talks about the things going on in the world that might be challenges to all of us. And it talks about, in a more kind of suggestive way, human resilience and the resilience of the human spirit, and the idea that love can get us through these crises together. And so this song, written a year and a half ago, ended up being the perfect song to end this album with, as we released it in late June. In mid-June, in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, and I want to get into criminal justice, but just one last question, because I'm sure people want to know, like, when do you show Chrissy the work? Do you like on a song like Never Break, do you write it all first and give her a finished piece, or when?
Yeah, I do. I do that. So she doesn't like to hear it too early because she knows it'll probably change. And she doesn't want to fall in love with the early version if it's going to change quite a bit. So I usually let her hear it when it's closer to the finish line.
All right. Okay, now moving to more serious stuff. I mean,
Uh-huh.
one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is coronavirus in prison. Before you
Hmm.
got on, I was just talking about how 6 out of every 10 people in prison haven't even been adjudicated guilty. So you're in
Yes.
prison and you can get coronavirus and basically a death sentence, and you've
Yeah.
never even been adjudicated for a crime. And at this point in time, the 5 largest spreaders of COVID in the country are all prisons, and we have
Yeah.
over 585 deaths and 68,000 cases. Um, what do you think? Is there any hope in our prison system in the short term? You've been such an eloquent voice in the long term, but what should they be doing in the short term?
Well, we have to understand that prisons and jails were never good for people. They have always been harmful. They've always had a record of making people come out worse than how they entered. There's always exceptions. There's always people that turn their lives around and figure things out while they're in there. But the idea that prisons have been rehabilitative and been edifying for the people that enter has never been true in America. People are tortured. They're exposed to a lot more violence. Young people are sexually abused. People are exposed to fear and violence and trauma, and they usually come out worse than how they entered. It is not a system that's built to enrich human lives. It's built to just destroy their souls, their humanity, to fill them with shame and expose them to violence and trauma. It's just not a good system. And I understand why people think that it's the only system we have to have some accountability for people committing violence or other things that we consider antisocial. But whatever we think it's trying to do when it comes to rehabilitation, it's not doing that. And I don't think it ever was meant to.
I think that's so well said. I mean, I think, every time one of my friends becomes a judge and they ask for advice, I mean, my advice to them is go actually visit a prison and see what
Yeah.
it's like. Because
Yeah.
it's the most foreign concept if you haven't been in one. It's
Yeah.
just like a totally different world with no freedom, guards who are just abusive and don't care about humanity often. I mean,
Well, the
there's different
guards' humanity gets sucked away by them working in the prison too.
yeah,
Like, it's not a healthy place for them to be either. It's not healthy for anybody,
yeah.
and it's not healthy for the guards. It may be decent for the local economy, keeping people employed and all the services that go into keeping these buildings going, but it's not good for any human being to be in that space with this kind of huge kind of gathering of people who've been troubled, who have been let down by society, who have gone through lots of trauma themselves. Having them piled on top of each other in close quarters, it's just not a healthy place. And so that's why I talk so much about mass incarceration, because I want us to figure out something better to do.
Yeah, and I had hoped that coronavirus would be the start of at least a temporary solution with people getting compassionate releases and
Hmm.
so on. But, Bill Barr has resisted that for a lot of people, unless you're the
Hmm.
president's friend, in which case,
Yeah.
then you can magically get out of
Yes.
jail. But otherwise, it's they're keeping so many people in. And again, people who haven't even been adjudicated of a crime. One of the things, John, that you've talked a lot about is cash bail. Could you
Hmm.
tell folks a little about what that is and why we should care about it?
Yeah. I think we've become so accustomed to it in the U.S. that we don't realize how egregious it is that we do this. We require that people pay money before they've been even tried, before they've been found guilty, anything. They've merely been accused of a crime, and if they have enough money, they can get out. But if they don't, they can't. And so it's by definition discriminating against people who don't have the resources to pay. And so what that does is create a system of leverage that the prosecutor has, because then they can say, well, we know you can't afford this amount of bail, so you might as well plead guilty to this or that. And it reduces the power that the defendant has, and it's merely because they don't have the money. They can afford it. They can't afford it. Harvey Weinstein, he was, I think it was millions of dollars of bail, but he could afford it. And if someone, accused of similar crimes, didn't have that money, they wouldn't have been able to afford it. And then there are people accused of way lesser crimes that don't have $1,000 or $1,500 or $2,500. They're living week to week, and they're going to lose their job if they get, if they have to stay in jail for a little while, and they can afford to pay the bail. So, we're just trapping people in jail just because they're poor. And it's not fair, and it needs to end. And so we've been working around the country to end cash bail.
Yeah, and it's something. It's not just unequal. It's also potentially, the intersection with coronavirus. These two things hit together. So
exactly. So you're in there for a minor offense. You haven't been even convicted yet. You may not have even done it, but because you don't have the money, you're stuck in this vector for disease, and you could die, or you could take it back home to your family and they die.
Yeah. One of the things in our prior conversations that's always struck me about you is that you're a reader, and you read a lot about race and justice. I remember having a conversation with you about Michelle Alexander's book. And people, I think, would find that a little surprising. Sexiest man alive as an avid reader.
Well, if they don't believe reading is sexy, then we got to convince them that it is.
I agree. But what should folks read if they're interested in the criminal justice system? Michelle Alexander's book, obviously. What else is?
I think another one that appealed to my heart, and it talks about policy as well, but Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. You saw Michael B. Jordan in the film, depicting Brian's life. He's a modern day, saint. He's one of those people that will shine as one of the great humans of this generation, really. And his book is so interesting, learning about the work that he does. A lot of his work is with the Equal Justice Initiative, particularly in, helping people who've been wrongly convicted, people who are on death row, get justice. And then he's also been doing a lot of great work around helping us have some accounting and some remembering and some retelling of America's history, so that we understand the foundations that got us into this mess that we're into right now. So we understand the context of the criminal justice system and why it's always been designed to be unfair. It's always been designed to be an extension of slavery and Jim Crow. He helps us understand that history so that we are not having this conversation currently without the context of history. So I think that's great. I got into a little hot water over the weekend, tweeting about housing discrimination and how realtors have been, complicit in that historically. And one of the books that I read that informed me about that was a book called The Color of Law. And you all should read that if you want any kind of understanding about why there is this legacy of housing segregation in America, how it's affected Black wealth, how it's affected what neighborhoods Black people have been able to live in over the years. All of that is seen today in our wealth gap. It's seen today in the areas that have the highest concentration of poverty and crime and other social ills. It's seen in so many things in our segregated schools. And a lot of people don't understand that this was government policy, bankers' policy, and realtors' policy that led us to these conditions. And this book really helps you understand that.
Yeah, and I feel like understanding of history is so important. Real history, not the kind of whitewashed, literally history that we got in schools.
Yeah, and we never, and what Brian talks about a lot, Stevenson, is that other societies, after they came out of some of these terrible eras in their history, like the Nazi era or genocide in Rwanda or apartheid in South Africa, they all had truth and reconciliation. They said, let's do a real accounting of what went wrong here and, face it as a nation, be accountable as a nation. And America's just never done that. And not only did we not do that, we intentionally rewrote the history books so that somehow the Confederacy came out as a noble, opponent in this, evenly matched, evenly, you know, good people on both sides, civil war.
Very kind. Yes.
You know, we've never had that kind of conversation where we really acknowledge what was wrong with slavery and the Confederacy, and stopped revering these Confederate leaders and generals, and actually said this was actually wrong. The nation should apologize for these things and do some reparation.
So where are you, John Legend, right now on the optimism scale? Because you're saying historically, you're right, we've never done any of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, last few weeks, you know, it's kind of amazing to see all these people marching, to see Mississippi vote down the Confederate flag yesterday. And so all these things. And, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being really optimistic, where are you right now?
Well, I think I'm by disposition optimistic. Always believe
we love that
tomorrow,
about you, man.
that tomorrow can be better. And I'm also hopeful in the sense that I believe that if we work at these things, we can actually get better. And there's something within the human spirit that we could always go the wrong direction. We can always have the Nazi era. We can always have slavery. We can always have these other horrible examples of man's inhumanity to man. But there are also so many examples of when we've done the right thing and worked together to achieve justice and equality and get us closer to a place where we are all free and all living together in harmony. So we just have to keep working so that we get ourselves to a better place. And if we don't have any hope, then we can't get there. So hope has to be part of our strategy.
Yeah, and I guess that's really my last question for you. Mm-hmm. It's about hope and optimism that's reflected in the song Never Break. And I mean, that's what it's all about, right? And
you have to have it. That's why you go to work every day. That's why you write the book that you write, because you feel like that, hey, I know things are bad right now, but if I tell this story, I can convince some folks and we can change the tide. If we work on these legislators long enough, they can change the laws and make a difference. If our organizers in the local communities keep preaching this message of reallocating these resources that we're committing to policing to other things that are more healthy and safe for the communities, we can actually make change in these communities. And we see enough times where that actually has worked, that it kind of fuels our optimism, fuels our hope, and makes us say, let's keep going at it and work some more.
Yeah, and I know it's the last song on the record, but it's through everything you do, John. The first song on the record, Bigger Love, you know, you say the world feels like it's crumbling. Every new day, another something. But in the end, nobody does a sin. And and that's what you stand for. And, you know, you give us hope and joy and optimism, but also a dose of reality. And you break some of the myths, which even I sometimes have about this country. And I am so grateful to you, and I think all of your listeners and viewers are as well. So we just wish you the best, and Chrissy and the kids, and onward and upward, man.
Thank you, Neil. Great to talk to you.
Thanks.
All right, take care.